Chapter 1. The Return of the Wolf. All across the world, people from all walks of life began changing into wolves. From a teenager sitting in a classroom in Mexico to a pregnant woman in Sydney, Australia. Women, men, the young, the old, changed before the eyes of everybody around them. You would think that such a mass metamorphosis of people would get the attention of the entire world, right? And it did, in some places. And that was why a certain secret society was asked to become some kind of supernatural police force and take any and every werewolf that was found into custody for their own safety. The secret society and the normally clandestine race in question were, of course, members of the Vampire Society, who mostly lived in every country around the world, and who had had a long hatred and despisal of werewolves for centuries, until one werewolf in particular married the Vampire King and effectively became the Vampire Queen. After Olivia Hunter, a werewolf, married Vega, the Vampire King, there began a wave of acceptance towards werewolves, at least those who openly identified themselves as being werewolves, or by those who had some kind of extrasensory perception of what certain supernatural individuals were capable of. However, after the ability of thousands of werewolves capable of changing from a human into a wolf and vice versa was seemingly taken away from them, through some unknown method and by some unknown assailant, it was believed that werewolves were now extinct. Several months after people from all around the world discovered that they were now human and nothing more, rumours started to circulate that one werewolf remained. One individual had retained the ability to be able to change from a human into a wolf and back again. Olivia Hunter. However, no one knew why this was. What made Olivia Hunter so special? Some ex-werewolves asked amongst themselves. But no one, not even Olivia Hunter, knew neither why werewolves were no longer werewolves, nor why Olivia Hunter was still a werewolf. Some people who used to identify themselves as being werewolves, who used to have the gift to be able to become a wolf, and who used to have all the abilities that come with being a werewolf, attempted to reach out to Olivia Hunter via members of the Vampire Society, but no one was given any kind of audience with Olivia Hunter. In fact, it was declared by Vega, the Vampire King himself, that Olivia, his wife, not be disturbed, nor asked why she was now the last werewolf on Earth. Then the supernatural world was led to believe that Vega, Olivia Hunter, and her daughter Melissa had left this universe and returned to the birthplace of vampires. At least, that is how the Vampire King described it in his address to his people. No one knew what Vega was talking about, because no one had ever heard of somewhere that might be the place of origin of vampires. However, most vampires were well aware that Vega, the Vampire King, was no ordinary vampire, especially after he survived multiple attempts on his life, or multiple vendettas as they are referred to. Most vampires, various supernatural beings, as well as ex-werewolves, were sad at the news that Vega and Olivia Hunter had somehow travelled to another universe and did not plan to return anytime soon. Vega had made it clear that he would return to the universe of his Vampire Society at some point to check on the progress of his people, but it was not made clear to anyone in particular when that may be. It was almost a year after Vega and Olivia Hunter were reported to have travelled to where Vega described as the birthplace of vampires, when the gift, the curse, the wolf within those who were once werewolves returned, to the shock and horror of many. Some werewolves who found themselves changing into a wolf again were sad, angry, disappointed that the wolf had returned to them. However, some ex-werewolves who transformed once again into a wolf were elated that they could once again become who and what they used to be and what they were meant to be. Some people were so appalled that they were once again burdened to become a wolf, whether they wanted to be or not, because they had inherited the gift, the curse of becoming a wolf through some kind of shared genetic lineage with someone who was also a werewolf, that they chose to end their lives instead of welcoming the wolf back with open arms. Knowledge of the return of the wolf almost spread to the entire world, and was almost known to a great number of the population of humanity who had little to no supernatural abilities whatsoever, had it not been for the steadfast action of the Vampire High Council, who used their global influence to not allow those who did not need to know that werewolves once again walked the earth. A select number of psychics, especially psychotherapists, were drafted by the Vampire Society to try and contain the outbreak of knowledge and rumour that certain individuals who looked human were actually werewolves, including one psychotherapist who called himself Dr. Brooks, who was renowned for the connections that he had made with world leaders from all around the world. Dr. Brooks had been responsible for advising prime ministers, presidents, kings, queens from all around the world for years. However, no one really knew who he was, nor what he was. Most people who had heard of Dr. Brooks believed that he was some kind of demon and was considered psychotic and psychopathic, as well as a psychotherapist. In any case, many people of power secretly sought out the advice of Dr. Brooks, and he willingly gave his advice and used his ability to further the political careers of many world leaders for decades. No one really knew what to do with werewolves once they returned to being werewolves. Even werewolves themselves. The vampires had their opinion. The shapeshifters had naturally divided opinions. The remaining gods who still existed on Earth, as well as in their own individual realms of existence, did not seem to care, and all the other supernatural species of many different forms did not really know what difference it made that there were once again werewolves in the world. However, then word started to spread that werewolves wanted some kind of recognition of who and what they were. They wanted their voice to be included in what was going on in the supernatural world that existed and thrived in every country there was. That was when several members of the Vampire Society decided to call for a meeting with several of the most vocal proponents of werewolf rights, so that their voice could be heard and a potential determination and course of action could be agreed upon. The meeting with several werewolves and a small number of vampires, two who were one of the 12 members of the Vampire High Council, was deemed a disaster by the werewolves who had attended the meeting in good faith, and who believed that they could be responsible for helping to usher in a new era for werewolves all around the world. However, the vampires in attendance openly mocked the werewolf contingency and addressed them and their ideas as being nothing but a fantasy. What? You want there to be a werewolf royal family or something? Don't we already have that somewhere? Said one of the vampires arrogantly and with a large grin, as if they were merely only entertaining what the werewolves had to say just so that they could make fun of them. Another vampire referred to werewolves as the dogs of the supernatural world, and they had no other reason to be than to make other werewolves. Of course, the werewolves at the meeting were enraged by what they heard and how they were treated, so much so that several of them transformed into their wolf form and began snarling, snapping, and howling at the vampires. However, it became clear very quickly that vampires would never take werewolves seriously, nor would they ever want anything resembling werewolves being thought of as equal to vampires. After the meeting, the werewolves who had attended left disheartened and literally with their tails between their legs, no pun intended, because even though they knew that most vampires had never had much respect for werewolves, until Olivia Hunter, a werewolf, became their queen, hearing the openly racial slurs made by vampires against their race at the meeting was too much for some werewolves to hear. Some werewolves started saying that perhaps they should value their anonymity and not advertise the fact that they were werewolves, while some started to openly declare among themselves that it was time for a change, and that werewolves deserved to have the right to decide their fate. It was well known to many of the supernatural races that vampires believed they were at the top of the food chain, so to speak, because they were the most ubiquitous supernatural species on Earth, so they should have a say into what happened, when, and why. It was also well known that more of humanity knew that vampires existed than knew there really were gods, mermaids, those who had reincarnated, as well as the many other supernatural races and beings. The werewolves said they wanted more recognition among their supernatural peers. No serious werewolf actually entertained the possibility of revealing who and what they were to the vast majority of the population of the world, because such an attempt would be deemed futile to the security and anonymity of all supernatural races and societies who wish to remain secret. However, a small minority of werewolves began to meet among themselves to talk about werewolf rights and what they thought they should do next to strengthen their cause to become a more valued voice among the people of Earth, at least among the supernatural people of the world. Of course, there were no openly werewolf politicians. There were no openly werewolf doctors. There were no openly werewolf priests. However, there were many werewolf police officers, gardeners, soldiers, teachers, who knew what they were and had known for most of their life. Of course, there were some werewolves who were genetically disposed to eventually become a werewolf, because a family member of theirs was. However, there were werewolves who became werewolves because they were attacked and bitten by a werewolf. The 1981 horror comedy film An American Werewolf in London was not only considered a cult classic by human movie fans, but it was also considered a must-watch for all werewolves who were always meant to be werewolves, as well as werewolves who became werewolves after becoming a werewolf because another werewolf made them a werewolf. However, every werewolf around the world is different, and the gift, curse that they find within themselves manifests itself in different ways, at different stages, and at different speeds, depending upon the individual. Which was why it was not easy for one werewolf to speak for all werewolves, because every werewolf was an individual, and that was why not every werewolf agreed that they needed a spokesperson to speak for them. Every werewolf would agree that they never wanted to be subservient to anybody, nor to anything, but most werewolves knew that there was a vast difference between them, and vampires in many ways. However, the most glaring difference was that vampires liked going to war against one another, whereas werewolves just wanted to be left alone to do their own thing. But it is true to say that most werewolves, like most wolves around the world, like being a part of a pack, a family, because they understand that sticking together keeps them strong. Years ago, one werewolf by the name of Tala tried to unite all the werewolves of the world, and she was successful in gathering together a large pack of werewolves to help her trap and kill her abusive ex-husband Mingan, who was also a werewolf. However, after that incident, after Tala was killed, most of the werewolves who were promised the world by Tala returned to their everyday lives and kept themselves to themselves, because no werewolf wanted any further open conflict with each other, nor anybody else, no matter what race they were. When werewolves returned, after a year of no longer existing, something had definitely changed in the way that werewolves saw one another. Unlike before, when they knew who and what they were, humans who could transform into wolves. When those who were once werewolves and who had lost their identity as a werewolf, when their ability to change into a wolf was taken away from them, had the wolf within them returned to them. Somehow, when they knew who and what they were again. They longed to seek out one another and see if they were the only one who was once again a werewolf. Everything and everyone longs to find their people in this world. Those who can understand what they can do and why they can do what they do. It's only natural. And every kind of people is naturally protective of their own race, which is perfectly understandable. Because, like the saying goes, you can't understand a person's life choices until you have walked in their shoes. Werewolves were everywhere. However, because not every werewolf could be at the same place at the same time, and because werewolves felt more comfortable when they could communicate with one another, even if they lived far away from one another, so many of the interactions that werewolves had in the 21st century happened, not surprisingly, over the internet and online. There were Facebook groups, chat rooms, WhatsApp groups, entire websites which werewolves used to communicate with one another and share their experiences of being a werewolf, which were encrypted and not easily hacked. But werewolves being werewolves, everyone who was a part of an online group or an online pack were always cautious that one day the secret of what defined their group would be discovered. Werewolves usually keep themselves at a distance from those who are not werewolves, including their family, because more often than not, when a werewolf attempted to reveal who and what they really were, it was like someone coming out and revealing that they were gay, transgender, or something like that. Because the fear that is felt of being judged and treated differently because you are not like everyone else around you is sometimes paralysing. Some werewolves find out who they are and immediately choose to take their own life because they know what is going to happen to them. Werewolves are taught, and they learn almost immediately, that they have to keep a secret about themselves, and most likely for the rest of their lives, because the vast majority of people around the world have no idea that werewolves, vampires, or most of the supernatural beings they may have heard of are, in fact, real, and not as fictitious as books, TV shows, and films would like them to believe. One of the most brilliant things that Vega, the Vampire King, did, and he was able to do this because he was not just a vampire but also an author, was to create and write a series of books, and over several years pepper his stories with real-life insights into what it meant to be a vampire where he came from, the so-called birthplace of vampires, which he ultimately returned to, which was brilliant, because what his readers thought was simply the fantastic story of a vampire king and a vampire queen living in a world of vampires at war with humans was based on what he had seen, heard, and experienced. But, of course, it was a work of fiction, and he used his poetic license to change certain things, even though he didn't need to. The Vampire King definitely subscribed to the old author's adage of write what you know, and it didn't do him any harm. 2 years after Olivia Hunter and Vega had left this universe and travelled to the birthplace of vampires, as it was referred to, and in the grounds of the former mansion home of the Vampire King, a woman who looked to be in her 40s was seen walking naked and covered from head to toe in blood. Several members of the Vampire High Council, who used the mansion as the place where they continued the governance of vampire society in the absence of the Vampire King, rushed to see who the woman covered in blood was. However, it didn't take the members of the council long, especially one member in particular, Valkyrie, to positively identify the woman to be none other than Olivia Hunter, but who seemed to be in a catatonic state. Olivia! Olivia! What happened? Where is the king? Where is Vega? Asked Valkyrie, one of the members of the Vampire High Council and one of the Vampire King's most loyal allies, as she stopped Olivia Hunter and held her in place as she looked into Olivia's unblinking eyes. Olivia did not reply immediately. However, after a few seconds, Olivia turned to look Valkyrie in the eye and she whispered, Dead. They're dead. My daughter. My husband. Everyone. They're all dead. Before Olivia seemingly lost consciousness and collapsed to the ground.